When the old horse refused to step onto the mountain pass, the corporate haulers laughed at its primitive instinct, right up until the moment a landslide turned their million-dollar rigs into twisted scrap metal on the edge of a cliff. The fog rolling over the Broken Spine Pass was thick enough to chew. Up here in the jagged altitudes of Iron Ridge County, Colorado, the calendar meant nothing. It was early autumn down in the flatlands, but at 9,000 feet, the morning frost bit into the bone like deep winter. The air was thin, carrying the sharp metallic scent of damp granite and dying pine. Gideon walked with a slow, measured cadence. His leather boots, cracked and caked with the gray mud of a dozen past seasons, crunched against the loose gravel of the narrow mountain road. The collar of his faded canvas jacket was turned up against the wind. He did not rush. A man who has survived a war learns early on that rushing usually only hurries you toward a shallow grave. Beside him walked Buster. The roan gelding was past his prime, his muzzle dusted with gray, his coat thick and coarse. He walked with a slight limp in his left hind leg, a souvenir from a rough winter 5 years back. They were entirely alone on the twisting mountain road, surrounded by the overwhelming heavy silence of the wilderness. Then the silence broke. Buster stopped. It was not a gradual slowing down. It was a dead, rigid halt, the horse's front hooves planted firmly into the dirt, his heavy head lowered, ears pinning flat against his skull. The muscles in his broad chest twitched violently beneath the leather harness. He let out a low, vibrating snort, his nostrils flaring wide as he drew in the freezing air. He refused to take another step forward. Gideon did not pull the reins. He did not click his tongue or snap a whip. He simply stood still, watching the animal. He placed a bare, calloused hand against the horse's neck, feeling the rapid, terrified thumping of the carotid artery. Buster was not looking at the road ahead. He was looking at the towering, vertical face of the mountain to their right. The horse took a step backward, his iron shoes scraping loudly against the stone. He was feeling a vibration in the earth that human feet were too numb to register. Before Gideon could turn his head, the modern world announced its arrival. It started as a low, unnatural hum vibrating through the canyon, quickly building into the aggressive, roaring whine of turbocharged diesel engines. The fog parted, pierced by the blinding glare of LED light bars. A convoy of heavy-duty transport trucks rounded the lower bend. They were massive, pristine machines painted in an obnoxious, high-gloss corporate blue. Down the side of the lead trailer, massive silver letters spelled out Vanguard Logistics. They were hauling oversized payloads of industrial mining equipment, taking the treacherous Broken Spine Pass to cut 3 hours off their route to the neighboring state line. It was a road meant for loggers and locals, not for 80,000 pounds of computerized steel. The lead rig closed the distance fast, too fast for the slick conditions. The driver saw the old man and the horse blocking the center of the narrow pass and slammed on the air brakes. The massive truck shuddered, pneumatic valves hissing violently as it skidded to a halt just 30 feet from Buster. The horse reared slightly, panicked by the sudden noise, but Gideon held the leather strap firm, keeping the animal grounded. The driver's side door of the lead rig swung open. Carter Thorne stepped down onto the running board. He wore a tailored fleece vest over a crisp, button-down shirt, completely out of place in the mud and freezing fog. His hair was slicked back, untouched by the wind. Thorne did not look at the treacherous drop-off to his left. He did not look at the unstable rock face to his right. He looked only at the muddy boots of the old man standing in his way. He tapped a heavy, oversized gold watch against the leather-wrapped steering wheel, his jaw tight with impatience. Thorne reached inside the cab and yanked the cord for the air horn. A deafening, localized blast of sound shattered the valley, echoing off the canyon walls like artillery fire. Buster sidestepped, his eyes wide with white showing. Gideon simply squinted. Thorne leaned out, a sneer cutting across his clean-shaven face. "Move the fossil, old man." His voice barked over the idling diesel engine. "You're blocking progress. We have a delivery window, and I'm not blowing my quarterly bonus because some cowboy wants to take a scenic stroll in the middle of a commercial lane." Gideon looked at the young manager. He looked at the gleaming chrome grille of the truck, the array of sensors on the bumper, the GPS antenna on the roof. Then he looked back at the mountain. The earth beneath his boots felt strangely hollow. Thorne slapped the side of his door. "Did you hear me? Get that flea-bitten meat out of the way, or I'll use my bumper to move you both. It's an outdated animal. It doesn't belong on this road." Gideon did not raise his voice. He did not defend his horse. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket, pulled out an old wooden pipe, and placed it between his teeth. He struck a wooden match against his thumbnail. The flame flared. He drew in the smoke, letting the burning tobacco mask the smell of the fracturing earth. Without a single word, Gideon took hold of Buster's halter. He guided the trembling horse backward, forcing them both to the extreme outer edge of the pass, their heels practically hanging over the 300-foot drop into the pine tops below. He gave Thorne the road. Thorne smirked, shaking his head in arrogant victory. He climbed back into the heated cab, shifted into gear, and laid heavily on the throttle. The massive truck surged forward, blowing a cloud of black exhaust directly into Gideon's face as it passed. 4 more identical trucks followed, their drivers laughing behind tinted glass, completely blind to the reality of the mountain. Gideon stood on the edge of the abyss, the smoke curling slowly from his pipe. He watched the shiny rubber tires roll arrogantly into the death trap. There is a certain kind of silence that a fast, loud world always mistakes for weakness. The modern man believes that because he can control a machine, he has conquered nature. But if you are watching this, you likely know better. You know that genuine strength doesn't need to shout, and that the wisdom of the old ways will always outlast the arrogance of the new. If you've ever felt cast aside by a world moving too fast for its own good, take a moment to subscribe. Walk this road with us. There is a storm coming, and you'll want to be here when the dust settles. Gideon patted Buster's neck. The horse had stopped trembling. The animal watched the convoy disappear around the upper blind curve of the pass. 10 minutes later, the mountain finally spoke. It did not begin with a crash. It began with a deep, structural groan that seemed to originate from the very center of the earth. A mile up the road, Carter Thorne sat in the ergonomic, air-suspended seat of his lead truck. The cab was a sanctuary of modern engineering. The climate control was set to a perfect 72 degrees. Acoustic dampening panels neutralized the harsh sounds of the wilderness outside. A satellite radio played a low-volume financial podcast. Thorne had one hand resting casually on the bottom of the steering wheel, his mind already calculating the profit margins of the day's early delivery. He was entirely disconnected from the reality of the environment he was driving through. Then, the cliff face above the blind curve simply let go. The sound wave hit the truck a fraction of a second before the earth did. The acoustic glass spiderwebbed instantly. Thorne's coffee spilled across the digital center console as a slab of gray granite the size of a suburban house detached from the mountainside and slammed onto the pavement directly in front of his bumper. Thorne reacted out of pure panic. He stomped his expensive leather loafer onto the brake pedal with all his weight. In a dry, controlled environment, the truck's onboard computers would have calculated the speed, weight, and friction, bringing the 80,000-pound rig to a safe, managed stop. But this was the Broken Spine Pass. The road surface was a treacherous layer of wet slate, freezing mud, and loose gravel. The anti-lock braking system panicked. The computer microprocessors fired hundreds of times a second, chattering the air brakes in a desperate attempt to find traction that did not exist. The massive steer tires locked, released, and locked again, skating over the slick mud. The momentum of the heavy mining equipment on the trailer pushed the cab forward relentlessly. Thorne watched in sheer horror as the hood of his truck shoved a pile of rubble forward, breaching the crumbled shoulder of the road. The front right tire dropped completely off the edge of the cliff. The entire rig violently pitched to the right. Gravity grabbed hold of the steel frame, threatening to pull the cab, the trailer, and Thorne into the 300-foot abyss below. The truck came to a gut-wrenching halt, the undercarriage grinding into the jagged rock of the precipice. It teetered there, perfectly balanced on the razor's edge of destruction. Inside the cab, the modern sanctuary transformed into a nightmare. The dashboard illuminated in a chaotic array of flashing red and yellow warning lights. A computerized voice began reciting error codes over the speakers. Traction control failure. Critical tilt angle. Engine derate. Forward collision system offline. The electronic transmission automatically locked itself down to prevent further damage, rendering the vehicle entirely immobilized. Thorne was frozen in his seat, pressed hard against the passenger side door by the severe angle of the cab. Below him, through the spider-webbed window, there was nothing but a vertical drop into the fog. He reached frantically for the CB radio on the dash. Dead static. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket. No service? The surrounding iron-rich mountains had entirely blocked the satellite and cellular signals. Behind him, the remaining 4 trucks had managed to stop just short of the landslide, but they were hopelessly trapped. The road was entirely blocked by thousands of tons of rock forward, and the narrow passage made backing up an impossibility. The cold began to seep through the cracked glass. The corporate convoy was completely paralyzed by the very mountain they had arrogantly tried to conquer. 2 miles down in the valley, where the heavy fog thinned out near a small patch of grazing land, Gideon unlatched the rusted iron gate of a holding pen. He led Buster inside, pulling the heavy leather harness from the horse's back. He ran a stiff brush over the animal's coarse coat, his movements methodical and calm. When the distant muffled rumble of the landslide echoed down the canyon walls, Gideon did not flinch. He did not look up in surprise. He simply stopped brushing for a moment, pulling his gold pocket watch from his vest. He noted the time. He had given them exactly the window of warning they had refused to take. Gideon gave Buster a final pat on the neck, filled a galvanized trough with fresh hay, and walked away from the pen. He bypassed his modest log cabin entirely, his heavy boots carrying him toward a dilapidated corrugated metal barn sitting at the edge of the property. The structure looked as though a strong gust of wind might flatten it, but the heavy padlock on the sliding wooden door was well oiled. He inserted an iron key, snapped the lock open, and threw his shoulder into the heavy timber door. It rolled back on rusty steel tracks, protesting loudly. The air inside smelled of stale sawdust, old grease, and high-octane history. Gideon grabbed the corner of a massive canvas tarp that dominated the center of the barn and pulled it back, kicking up a cloud of dust that danced in the pale light. Sitting in the shadows was a 1,952 REO Speedwagon M34. It was a 2.5-ton, 6x6 military cargo truck painted in flat olive drab that had long since faded to a dull, bruised green. There was no chrome. There was no aerodynamic styling. The front bumper was a solid steel I-beam. Mounted behind it was a massive, gear-driven mechanical winch wrapped in thick, braided steel cable. It was a machine built for a war that had ended before most of the men on that mountain were even born. Gideon did not need a laptop to check its diagnostics. He climbed up into the Spartan open-air cab. The seat was cracked olive canvas over raw springs. The dashboard was nothing but heavy toggles and mechanical gauges with faded white numbers. He reached down and flipped the master battery switch. A heavy clack echoed in the barn. He pulled out the manual choke, pumped the accelerator pedal twice to prime the carburetor with raw gasoline, and pressed his boot down on the heavy floor starter. The engine did not turn over with a polite, computerized hum. It fought. The starter motor whined aggressively for 3 seconds before the Rio Gold Comet inline-6 engine violently roared to life. It spat a thick plume of blue-gray exhaust out of the vertical stack, the unburned fuel burning off as the mechanical idle smoothed out into a deep, guttural throb. The entire barn vibrated with the rhythmic beating of 6 massive steel pistons. There were no microchips regulating the air-fuel mixture. There were no emission sensors restricting its power. It was pure, unfiltered combustion. Gideon pulled on a pair of thick, insulated leather work gloves. He reached behind the seat and retrieved a heavy iron pry bar and a coil of 3/4-inch transport chain. He threw the heavy gear stick into first, engaging the transfer case to lock all 6 wheels into low range. The M34 rolled out of the barn, its massive lugged tires chewing into the frozen dirt of the driveway. Gideon pointed the blunt, steel nose of the truck back up toward the Broken Spine Pass. He drove into the thickening fog, a phantom of steel and oil rising from the pass to meet a future that had failed. The temperature on the Broken Spine Pass had plummeted to 19 degrees. Ice crystals formed rapidly over the cracked windshield of Carter Thorne's teetering rig. Inside the cab, the digital dashboard was entirely dead. The battery had drained itself dry trying to keep the onboard diagnostic computers awake. Thorne sat huddled in his ruined fleece vest, his breath pluming in the freezing cabin. Outside, his 4 drivers stood clustered together, stamping their boots in the mud, completely helpless. Their modern communication devices were nothing but expensive bricks in their pockets. Then they heard it. It was not the high-pitched, digitized wail of an emergency siren. It was a deep, rhythmic thudding echoing up the canyon walls. It sounded like the heartbeat of a mechanical beast. The fog began to glow with the dull yellow light of round, sealed-beam halogen headlamps. The 1952 REO Speedwagon M34 emerged from the mist. It did not slip. It did not slide. Its 6 massive, heavily lugged tires bit into the frozen slate, crawling up the steep, treacherous incline with relentless, gear-driven torque. The heavy steel leaf springs groaned under the chassis, absorbing the brutal terrain without a single electronic sensor to guide them. Gideon parked the M34 20 yards from the landslide, positioning it precisely in the center of the narrow road. He reached down and yanked the heavy mechanical parking brake lever. The steel ratchet clicked loudly, locking the drive shaft in place. He stepped out of the open cab, his heavy boots hitting the mud with a solid, deliberate thud. He walked past the shivering Vanguard drivers without a single glance. He approached the edge of the cliff where Thorne's cab hung suspended over nothingness. Thorne shoved his door upward against gravity, sliding out and dropping into the ankle-deep freezing mud. His polished leather loafers vanished instantly into the muck. He shivered violently, his jaw tight, his tailored clothes smeared with gray clay. He wrapped his arms around himself, trying desperately to project authority through his chattering teeth. "Took you long enough," Thorne stammered, his voice thin against the wind. "Where is the county rescue? Did you call a heavy-duty rotator?" "We need a helicopter." "This is $1 million payload you're looking at, old man." Gideon did not argue. He did not mock the young manager. He simply looked at Thorne's shaking hands. Then he looked at the massive rig dangling dangerously over the abyss. He turned on his heel and walked calmly back to the M34. From a bolted steel lockbox mounted beneath the passenger seat, Gideon withdrew a thick, yellowed piece of heavy paper. It was protected inside a scuffed, waterproof leather folio. He walked back to Thorne and held out the document. In his other hand, he offered a simple, heavy, brass ballpoint pen. Thorne stared at the pen. "What is this?" he demanded, panic edging into his voice. "I need a tow, not paperwork." "Read it," Gideon said. His voice was like grinding stones. Calm, absolute. Thorne's trembling fingers took the folio. The heading at the top of the page was stamped in faded, typewritten black ink. Iron Ridge County Mountain Salvage Claim, Act of 1983. It was a localized, archaic piece of legislation. It was born in a brutal era when massive timber operations routinely lost heavy equipment to the unforgiving mountains, allowing private citizens to claim emergency salvage rights on abandoned or perilous wrecks when state rescue was impossible. Thorne's eyes darted down the page, scanning the heavy typescript until he hit the compensation clause. Compensation for immediate, unassisted wilderness extraction. 15% of the total gross value of the salvaged vehicle, including all attached freight. Thorne's face lost whatever color the mountain cold hadn't already stolen. The custom transport rig and the specialized mining equipment bolted to its trailer were worth roughly $2.4 million. 15% of that was $360,000. Just for the lead truck? "This is extortion," Thorne whispered. The corporate arrogance was entirely gone, replaced by the hollow realization of his own powerlessness. "This is highway robbery." Gideon took a slow drag from his wooden pipe. The red cherry glowed intensely in the fog, casting a brief, warm light over his weathered face. "That truck is shifting 2 inches every hour," he said quietly. He pointed the stem of his pipe at the rear drive tires of the Vanguard rig. The mud beneath them was visibly cracking, small pebbles tumbling over the edge into the void. "By nightfall, gravity takes it all. The mountain claims 100%. I claim 15? Sign it or step aside." Thorne looked back at his drivers. They looked away, their eyes fixed on the muddy ground. He looked at his dead, useless smartphone. Then he looked down into the crushing depth of the abyss. The mountain did not care about his quarterly bonus. It did not care about his title. With a shaking hand, Thorne snatched the brass pen. He pressed the tip hard against the yellowed paper, violently scrawling his signature on the bottom line. Gideon took the folio back. He checked the signature, folded the leather cover neatly, and returned it to his heavy canvas breast pocket. The contract was binding. The weapon had been fired. The shift in power was complete. Gideon turned his back on Thorn and walked to the front bumper of the M34. He reached into the massive mechanical winch assembly bolted directly to the truck's frame. He disengaged the locking dog. He grabbed the heavy forged steel hook at the end of the cable and began to pull. The thick braided steel wire unspooled with a raw metallic scraping sound. It was heavy, brutal work. Gideon dragged 50 feet of the greased steel cable through the freezing mud, his breath pluming in the cold air. He crawled beneath the front of the suspended Vanguard truck, ignoring the creaking sounds of the massive vehicle shifting above him. He bypassed the fragile plastic aerodynamic bumper entirely. He found the solid, primary steel crossmember of the frame and looped the heavy transport chain around it, binding it tightly with a slip hook. He attached the winch cable to the chain, ensuring the tension was dead center. He crawled out from under the rig, his jacket soaked in mud and freezing water. He walked back to the M34, wiping his hands on an oily rag. The preparation was done. Now it was time for the fossil to work. Gideon climbed into the open cab of the M34. He did not rev the engine aggressively. He slipped the main transmission into neutral and engaged the heavy power takeoff (PTO) lever mounted to the floorboard. A deep, grinding clunk vibrated through the steel floor as the transmission diverted the engine's raw power directly into the front winch drum. He gripped the manual throttle lock, setting the engine RPM to a steady, powerful hum. He stepped out of the cab, standing on the thick steel running board, leaning over to keep one hand firmly on the winch control lever outside the door. Thorn and his drivers backed away, watching in skeptical silence. They were staring at a 70-year-old rust bucket preparing to fight the laws of physics against an 80,000-pound giant hanging over a cliff. Gideon pulled the lever back. The heavy steel cable suddenly snapped taut, rising out of the mud like an angry iron snake. Water and dirt squeezed out of the braided wire under extreme tension. The massive winch drum began to turn with agonizing slowness. The REO speedwagon groaned. The thick front leaf springs compressed heavily as the weight of the massive Vanguard rig transferred onto the M34's chassis. The engine RPM dipped slightly, bogging down under the impossible strain. Gideon did not panic. He simply pushed the throttle lock forward a quarter of an inch. The inline-six engine roared deeper, spitting a thick cloud of black carbon exhaust into the freezing air. It was a mechanical beast, digging in its heels. There was a deafening metallic shriek. It was the sound of the Vanguard truck's frame scraping violently against the jagged slate of the cliff edge. "The cable's going to snap," Thorn yelled, covering his face with his arms. Gideon did not flinch. He kept a steady, unyielding pressure on the lever. The old M34 did not rely on computers to calculate drag. It relied on sheer gear reduction. A 10,000-pound winch pulling through a block-and-tackle setup was multiplying the force exponentially. Slowly, impossibly, the front tire of the modern transport truck appeared over the edge of the cliff. The M34's engine roared a continuous, unbroken note of pure power. The thick steel cable hummed with a vibration that could be felt in the chest. Inch by agonizing inch, the Vanguard rig was dragged backward, its locked wheels tearing deep trenches through the freezing mud. With a final, violent lurch, the heavy truck cleared the precipice. Its massive front tires slammed down onto solid earth, the suspension violently bouncing before settling into the mud. It was safe. The silence that followed the engine's return to idle was profound. The mountain wind seemed to quiet down, as if acknowledging the stubborn will of the old man and his machine. Thorn stood frozen, staring at his $1,000,000 rig sitting securely on flat ground. His hands slowly dropped from his face. The reality of what had just happened settled over him like a heavy, suffocating blanket. His advanced technology, his corporate backing, his arrogance, all of it had been rendered entirely useless by a single old man in a mud-caked jacket, armed with an ancient piece of steel and an even older piece of paper. Gideon disengaged the PTO and shut down the throttle lock. He walked over to the Vanguard rig, unhooked the heavy chain from the crossmember, and tossed it into the back of the M34 with a loud, metallic clatter. He spooled the winch cable back onto the drum by hand, the methodical sound of turning gears echoing in the quiet valley. He didn't bother to ask if Thorne needed the other trucks moved. The landslide blocked the road ahead, meaning the vanguard convoy would have to spend the next 2 hours slowly backing down the winding mountain pass in reverse, a humiliating retreat back to the flatlands where they belonged. Gideon climbed back into the driver's seat of the M34. He pushed the heavy gear stick into reverse. Before he released the clutch, he looked out the open window. Thorne was standing there, shivering in his ruined clothes, his face pale and defeated. The young manager looked up at Gideon. He opened his mouth, struggling to find words. The superiority was gone. I owe you. Thorne forced the words out. It sounded painful. Gideon reached into his pocket and pulled out his wooden pipe. He struck a match on the steel dash, lighting the tobacco. He took a long, slow draw, blowing the smoke out into the cold air. He looked at Thorne, his eyes completely flat and devoid of emotion. "You don't owe me a thing," Gideon said quietly, his voice cutting through the chill. "You owe the bank $360,000. He engaged the clutch. The M34 lurched backward, its massive tires gripping the road. "Next time," Gideon called back over the rumble of the engine, "listen to the damn horse." The olive-drab truck disappeared back down the mountain, swallowed by the fog, leaving the corporate giants stranded in the mud, staring at the empty road where the fossil had just saved their lives. The world will always try to tell you that newer is better, that speed is more valuable than strength, and that the old ways are obsolete. But there is a reason we hold on to the past. There is a reason a solid piece of steel and a lifetime of quiet observation will outlast any microchip. The modern world builds things to be replaced. The old world built things to endure. If this story reminded you of the value of patience, of the quiet strength found in the people who work with their hands and honor the laws of nature, then you belong here with us. Hit the subscribe button. Stay a while. The world outside might be rushing toward the edge of a cliff, but here we know exactly when to stop, listen, and let the old horse lead the way.